The mortgage refinance was supposed to be the boring part of our year, the kind of paperwork afternoon you forget about within a week. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of identity documents spread out for the loan officer's verification checklist and noticing almost as an afterthought that Marcus's passport had been renewed 6 times in 11 years. Not expired and renewed once or twice the ordinary way. 6 times. Early every single time, months before the old one would have lapsed. I flipped through it out of nothing more than idle curiosity while we waited for a document to print, and found every single page empty. No stamps, no visas, no evidence a single one of those 6 passports had ever crossed a border at all. My name is Elise. I work as a forensic accountant, the kind of job where I spend my days finding the exact place a set of numbers stops telling the truth. And I've built a career on the simple, unglamorous belief that patterns matter more than explanations people offer for them after the fact. Marcus and I have been married 11 years. He works as a controller for a regional manufacturing company, methodical, careful, the kind of man who alphabetizes the spice rack without being asked. I'd never once had a professional reason to look closely at his personal documents until a bored afternoon, and a loan officer's checklist put one directly in my hands. I asked him about it that same evening, mostly out of genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, the way you'd ask about any small oddity in your spouse's habits. He said something about liking to keep it current in case work ever sent him abroad on short notice. A vague, plausible-sounding answer that I accepted completely at the time, filing it away the way you file away 100 other small explanations you never think to verify. I want to back up, though, because understanding what actually happened means understanding who Marcus was before I ever met him, a version of his life he rarely discussed in any real detail. He'd worked in his late 20s as a junior accountant at a manufacturing firm 2 states over a job he left abruptly. According to the little he'd told me over the years, after some vague falling out with management he never wanted to elaborate on. I knew there'd been some kind of investigation at that company around the same time, something involving misreported earnings that made local business news for a news cycle or two. Though Marcus had always waved off any direct questions about it, saying only that it was a complicated, unpleasant chapter he'd rather leave behind him. Whenever the subject came up early in our relationship, he had a practiced way of closing it, gently. A soft laugh, a change of subject, a line about how everyone has one job they'd rather forget. I remember finding that charming once evidence of a man who didn't dwell on old grievances the way some people do. It took me 11 years to understand that what I'd read as easy resilience had actually been years of careful, deliberate containment. I've spent 9 years in forensic accounting, which means I spend my professional life doing exactly what most people never think to do, with a document reading it for what it implies rather than simply what it states. A passport renewed 6 times without a single stamp isn't evidence of anything specific on its own. But patterns like that don't usually exist without a reason sitting quietly underneath them, and once I'd noticed it, I found I genuinely couldn't stop noticing it the way any trained eye eventually can't unsee the thing it's built to catch. The years that followed our conversation about the passport unfolded normally on the surface, though certain details started arranging themselves differently once I finally had a reason to look for a pattern instead of individual disconnected moments. Marcus kept the passport in a specific drawer in his home office, always in the same spot, and I noticed once I started paying attention that he checked it more often than someone with no travel plans. Reasonably should a quick glance during evenings when he thought I wasn't watching closely, the kind of habitual check you do with something you need to always know the exact location of. I noticed, too, that he'd memorized our local passport office's exact hours and expedite fees the way most people memorize a favorite restaurant's specials, a level of familiarity that felt strange, only in hindsight once I understood there was no actual travel behind any of it. He kept a small folder of backup documents alongside it, an old birth certificate copy, a laminated card with emergency contacts, the kind of folder you'd expect from someone bracing for an evacuation rather than someone planning a vacation. A co-worker of his, a woman named Preeti, who I'd met at a handful of company events over the years, mentioned once lightly that Marcus had asked HR unprompted about the company's international travel policy and expedited visa sponsorship process questions that struck her as odd, since Marcus's role had never once required international travel in the 4 years she'd worked alongside him. She mentioned it the way you mention any small workplace curiosity, forgotten by both of us within the same conversation. Around the same time, Marcus's sister Elise asked me during an otherwise unremarkable phone call whether Marcus still kept in touch with anyone from his old job at the manufacturing company 2 states over. I told her I didn't think so, that he rarely brought it up at all. She went quiet in a way that felt, even then, oddly weighted, before changing the subject to something about our upcoming holiday plans. I found an old bank statement once sorting through files for tax season, showing a small recurring monthly transfer to an account I didn't recognize modest enough that I assumed without much thought it was some kind of subscription or automatic bill I'd simply forgotten setting up myself. I didn't think to actually trace it at the time. I had no reason yet to think it connected to anything beyond ordinary household clutter. There was an evening maybe 4 years into noticing the passport habit, when Marcus came home visibly rattled after checking the mail, holding an envelope he tucked into his jacket pocket, before I got a clear look at the return address. When I asked what it was, he said it was nothing, a delayed bill and answer delivered a beat too fast to feel entirely natural. I let it go the way you let go of 100 small oddities that don't yet have anywhere to attach themselves in your understanding of a person you've trusted completely for over a decade. The renewal pattern itself never wavered. Every passport without exception got renewed roughly 18 months before its actual expiration, an unusually early window that I only understood the significance of once I finally sat down and actually researched what that specific margin typically indicates. It's the kind of buffer people maintain when they need a document that will remain valid for a minimum guaranteed period, no matter when an unexpected need to use it might arise, the opposite of someone who simply forgets to renew until the last minute. If you noticed a pattern like this in your own spouse's paperwork, would you have confronted them with the observation itself? Or would you have needed to understand exactly what it meant before saying anything at all the way I did? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what I eventually found had nothing to do with another woman, another country, or anything close to what 6 unstamped passports initially led me to imagine. I want to be clear that my mind went to the obvious place, first the way I suspect most people's would. A man quietly keeping travel documents current, a hidden bank transfer, an unexplained flinch at the mail. 6 renewals with no stamps to show for any of them, all of it reads on the surface exactly like the setup for an affair or a second life somewhere I wasn't a part of. I spent a full week privately bracing myself for that specific kind of ending before I ever sat down to actually trace where the money and the pattern genuinely led. I finally sat down properly with everything I'd noticed on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, while Marcus was out running errands pulling together the renewal dates, the odd bank transfer, Pretty's offhand comment about visa sponsorship questions, Aline's strange silence about his old job, the rattled reaction to that one piece of mail years earlier. Laid out together on paper in the methodical way I lay out any set of numbers that stopped adding up cleanly, the pattern read less like wanderlust and more like readiness, the specific disciplined readiness of someone maintaining an exit plan they hoped never to actually need. I sat at that table for over an hour, rereading the same 6 dates, unable to fully absorb that the man who alphabetized our spice rack had also apparently spent over a decade quietly rehearsing how to disappear. I traced the recurring bank transfer properly that same afternoon, something I'd never bothered doing when it seemed like ordinary household noise. It led to a private mailbox service 2 towns over registered under Marcus's name, alone, a detail that told me immediately this wasn't a shared household expense I'd simply forgotten about. It was something he'd built and maintained separately quietly for years. Before I said anything to Marcus, I called Elise directly, telling her plainly that I'd noticed some odd patterns and needed to understand what she knew about his old job. She hesitated for a long moment before admitting carefully that Marcus had told her years ago in confidence that he'd reported financial irregularities at that manufacturing company to federal investigators' testimony that had contributed to an executive's eventual conviction, and that Marcus had received what she only vaguely understood as a warning sometime after the trial concluded, suggesting it might be safer for him to be prepared to leave quickly if certain people connected to the case were ever released or relocated near him. I sat with that information for a full day before I said anything to Marcus directly needing to understand its full shape, the way I'd need to understand any complex financial structure before drawing a conclusion from a single piece of it. I pulled public court records that evening, the kind of documentation my job trained me to read quickly and completely, and found Marcus's name exactly where Eileen's memory had placed it, listed as a cooperating witness in a federal fraud case against his former employer's CFO, a man named Gerald Voss, convicted 11 years ago on charges connected almost exactly to the timeline Marcus had always kept deliberately vague. I drove to the private mailbox service the next morning, and the clerk, after some hesitation about privacy policy, confirmed only that the box received occasional certified mail. Nothing more he was willing to share without Marcus's direct authorization. I didn't push further. I already had enough to finally understand what I was looking at. I brought everything home that evening. The court records the mailbox confirmation, the 6 renewal dates laid out in a neat, undeniable timeline, and waited for Marcus in the kitchen, unsure for the first time in a long while exactly how this conversation was actually going to go. He came home a little after 6, and something in my expression must have told him immediately that whatever version of an ordinary evening he'd expected wasn't the one he was walking into. He set his keys down slower than usual, watching me the way you watch someone when you already suspect the conversation you're about to have. I told him plainly that I knew about Gerald Voss, about the testimony about the mailbox, about 11 years of a passport kept perpetually ready to leave on short notice. I told him I understood finally why 6 renewals had never once produced a single stamp. For a long moment, something in him gave way entirely. The careful, methodical composure I'd built 11 years of marriage around simply falling away. He said the warning had come quietly through his old attorney months after the trial, vague enough that he'd never been able to determine how seriously to take it, specific enough that he'd never been able to fully dismiss it either. He said he hadn't wanted to build our entire marriage around a threat that might never materialize, that telling me felt for years like handing me a fear he had no way of actually resolving for either of us. Then something harder crept back into his voice, exhausted rather than defensive. He said he genuinely believed for a long time that carrying this alone was protecting me, that a wife who didn't know there was anything to fear could simply live a normal life, instead of one shaped around a danger that had until this exact moment never once become real. I told him that protecting me from a fear wasn't the same as protecting our marriage from a lie, that 11 years of watching him check a drawer, renew a passport, early flinch at unexpected mail had all quietly become part of the architecture of our life, together, without me ever understanding what I was actually looking at. He didn't have an immediate answer for that. Eventually, he admitted that some part of him had also been unable to let go of the exit plan itself, that maintaining it had become its own strange comfort over the years. Proof that whatever happened, he'd built himself a way out, even if the way out was never something he actually wanted to use. He said it quietly, almost embarrassed by how much sense it made once he finally said it out loud, an admission that seemed to surprise even him as it left his mouth. I asked him carefully whether Voss had ever actually been released or relocated or done anything at all in 11 years to justify the warning still shaping so much of how Marcus moved through the world. He admitted quietly that Voss had been released 2 years earlier, that he'd known that he'd simply never told me, choosing instead to quietly renew the passport one final time and say nothing. His hands were still on the table when he said it, and I watched him press them flat against the wood, the same way you brace yourself before admitting something you already know will change everything that comes after it. That admission landed harder than anything before it. Not the old fear carried privately for over a decade before we ever met. The recent one chosen deliberately kept from me in real time for 2 full years, while I packed his lunches and planned our anniversaries and refinanced our mortgage, completely unaware that a genuine current threat had been quietly reactivated somewhere in the back of his mind the entire time. Aline called me a few days later, not to defend her brother, but almost relieved to finally speak honestly about something she'd carried as a secret for years herself. She said she'd urged him more than once to tell me the full truth, that she'd hated being the only other person who understood why he kept that passport so carefully current, and that she was sorry for every conversation where she'd deflected my questions instead of simply telling me herself. She told me, too, that she'd worried quietly for years about what it was doing to Marcus to carry something this heavy entirely alone, watching her brother grow steadily more private in ways she'd never fully understood until I finally asked her the right question directly. We contacted Marcus's old attorney together the following week, updating our own safety planning properly for the first time, with someone who actually understood the legal landscape, rather than relying on a decade-old private arrangement Marcus had built entirely inside his own head. The attorney confirmed that Voss's release conditions included standard no-contact provisions with any witnesses from the original case protections that had existed the entire time Marcus had been quietly living as though they didn't. Sitting in that office together, hearing an actual professional lay out the real current safeguards in place, felt like the first genuinely shared moment we'd had around this entire situation in over a decade. The final piece came a month later from the attorney's office, directly confirming that Voss had relocated across the country after his release, nowhere near us engaged, as far as any monitoring showed, in an entirely unrelated life. The threat, whatever shape it had actually held at any point over 11 years, appeared to have simply never materialized at all. A decade of quiet readiness built around a danger that ultimately never came looking for him. Reading that confirmation felt strange, in a way I hadn't expected, relief tangled together with something almost like grief for 11 years spent in part preparing for a version of our life that was never actually going to happen. Marcus and I are still working through what those 11 years actually cost us, not in the dramatic way betrayal usually gets described, but in the slower accumulation of a marriage quietly shaped by a fear only one of us was ever allowed to feel directly. We've been in counseling for 2 months now, working through what it means to actually share a threat instead of unilaterally deciding alone how much of it the other person can handle. Our counselor asked us both in one particularly difficult session what we thought we were each protecting by keeping things unspoken for so long. Marcus by managing an old fear entirely alone, me by never once asking harder questions about a habit I'd simply accepted without examining for the better part of a decade. Neither of us had a fully satisfying answer. I think some part of me always sensed there was a weight underneath that passport drawer I wasn't being shown, and some part of me preferred the unexamined version of our marriage to whatever complicated truth might be waiting underneath it. I don't check the passport drawer anymore, though I noticed a few weeks ago that Marcus finally let the current one lapse without renewing it early the first time. In 11 years, he's let a deadline simply pass without treating it like an emergency. I'm not sure yet whether that means he's finally let the fear go, or whether he's simply decided after everything that I deserve to know before he ever quietly renews it again. I think often about how close I came to never noticing any of it at all, how easily a mortgage refinance could have stayed exactly the boring paperwork afternoon it was supposed to be. I think about 11 years of a man quietly, carefully preparing to disappear if he ever needed to, never once telling the person he'd actually have had to leave that plan running silently underneath. There's a particular strangeness to finding out a threat existed years after it should have been shared. A delayed kind of fear that doesn't behave the way fresh fear does. I don't lie awake worrying about Gerald Voss showing up at our door. Not anymore. Now that I understand where he actually is, and what the attorney's monitoring shows. What keeps me up occasionally instead is smaller and stranger. The memory of 11 ordinary anniversaries celebrated beside a man quietly rehearsing an exit he never let me help him plan. Pretty mentioned recently gently that she still thinks about that offhand comment about visa sponsorship, wondering aloud whether she should have said something to me directly, instead of simply finding it curious and moving on. I told her there was no way she could have known what she was actually noticing, that even I, married to the man and trained professionally to read exactly this kind of pattern, needed a boring afternoon of mortgage paperwork before any of it finally clicked into place. If you've ever discovered your spouse was carrying a fear alone that should have belonged to both of you, tell me in the comments how you found out and whether it changed how you understood the whole shape of your marriage afterward. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever mistaken someone else's silence for something far simpler than what it actually was.